wherever you are, on behalf of the Department of English, University of Goulbongo, let me welcome you to another session of Parley 2021. We are back, and back with a vengeance. Unfortunately, for a couple of months, we had to shelve the program because of unavoidable circumstances. We are really very sorry to say that we have lost our ex-dean, Professor Bikash Roy, who is no longer with us. And I would like to dedicate this lecture to his memory. And before we hand over the charge of this program to Professor Robert Jacobs, I would like to introduce him. We are really very happy to have with us Professor Robert Jacobs. He is a professor of history of science and technology. In fact, his areas of specialization include nuclear technology and radiation technopolitics. And he is associated with the Hiroshima Peace Institute as well as the Hiroshima City University. He is actually jointly working on a project, the Global Hibakusha project, and we hope that his monograph, The Nuclear Bodies, the Global Hibakusha, will be published by the Yale University Press in 2022. You know, as a kid, we read And There Will Come Soft Rain by Ray Bradbury and Alas, Babylon by Pat Frank. From those days, we have always been at once fascinated and flummoxed by the enormous energy that can be unleashed by nuclear reaction. Nuclear Humanities is a very relevant field, and because we over here are really trying to expose our students to cutting-edge research across various disciplines, we thought a lecture on nuclear humanities was very much on the cards. We are all aware of the fact that in South Asia, there is an arms race. Nuclear weapons are so powerful and potentially so destructive that being responsible while using nuclear energy is itself a very, very dicey thing. So I think through his lecture, Professor Robert Jacobs is going to make clear many things about the Global Hibakusha project as well. Nuclear exposure is a dangerous thing, as we all know. It's very harmful not only to man and animals, but also to our Mother Earth. So without further ado, let me now request Professor Robert Jacobs to address us. It's over to you both.
Oh, thank you very much. And I really want to thank you, Professor Bhattacharya, and also the university for inviting me, and all of you for joining this afternoon. It's really my honor to be here. And very much as you said, in a sense, from the start, from 1945, when people first became aware of nuclear technologies, a lot of our ability to think about them came through science fiction books like the ones you mentioned, science fiction movies, and media and culture were really a key place where people learned about nuclear weapons, nuclear technology, radiation. And That happened fairly quickly, though there were science fiction stories within a few years, really within 1 year of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But study of them was a little slower and it went through a variety of changes. So today I'll be talking about nuclear humanities, which is essentially the humanities focusing on nuclear issues, nuclear technologies, and nuclear related issues like radiation. And partway through the lecture, in the middle of the lecture, I'll be talking about my own work, the Global Hibakusha Project, and how it reflects some of the kinds of humanities inquiry going on with nuclear technologies today. So if I can, it'll take me just a second to share. Okay. There. Now, can I ask somebody to confirm that you can see the screen?
It is visible, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. So this was a book that I edited a few years ago about just this topic, the nuclear humanities in a post-Cold War world. And so this is a lot of what I'll be talking about, the way that nuclear humanities shifted after the Cold War, the way that it was during the Cold War, the way that it shifted during the Cold War. And I will also be talking about the Global Hibakusha, which I'll explain in just a minute what that means. That's an English word and a Japanese word put together for the name of the project that I've been working on for 10 years or more. But really, where I'll start is where, for most of us, this began, which is with the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Really, very few people in the world had any idea that there could be such things as nuclear weapons until August 6th, 1945, when people read about it in the newspapers or heard about it in the radio and saw photographs like this of the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. And I would also point out that frequently you will hear people use the expression when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that is a passive construction, that they were dropped, sort of like it was an accident. So I use the phrase nuclear attacks because these were attacks with nuclear weapons. This is the actual weapon that was used that created all of the destruction here in Hiroshima, where I am today. This was the day before the weapon was detonated over Hiroshima and killed about 100,000 people almost instantly, and 140, 150,000 people within a year. So a lot of people died on that day in Hiroshima and on August 9th in Nagasaki, and a lot of people died soon after. But also a lot of people survived. Hundreds of thousands of people were affected by these attacks and survived, and those people are known in Japan as Hibakusha, a survivor of those two nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki. Pardon me. A lot of people that survived, many of them were injured, many of them were burned, as these people were. Many of them also went through extreme trauma and lost family members, as this boy did. He is carrying his baby brother to a place for a funeral in Nagasaki a few days after the attack. And also because of the nature of radiation, people continued to get sick for decades. People, even today, who survived are developing diseases, even in their old age, that are directly related to their exposures to radiation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so in a sense, this is a different kind of weapon of war. Most weapons of war, once an attack is over, the injuries don't proceed. With nuclear weapons, you may have survived the attack, you may be perfectly healthy for 10 years, and then suddenly develop a cancer related to the nuclear attack and die from it. So it can continue to kill for decades and decades later, which is partly why it's a particularly heinous kind of weapon. So the Global Hibakusha Project, I'll explain that a little bit further, when I get to it, but the word Hibakusha is people who survived nuclear attacks, people who survived exposures to radiation. Well, looking at the humanities, nuclear weapons were considered a fundamental problem for humanists, a fundamental problem for social scientists immediately, even on the day of the attack. And one of the first ways that people framed their understanding of the humanistic question was that something was wrong with human beings. For human beings to develop technologies like this, to use technologies to make weapons that can destroy whole cities in less than a second, that can treat human beings as matter rather than as human beings, that says something bad about human beings. One of the so, for example, this was an op-ed, an editorial written by Norman Cousins, who was an American publisher and editor. He was the publisher of the Saturday Review of Literature, which was a very prominent magazine in 1945. And when he heard about the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima, he wrote this editorial, "Modern Man is Obsolete." And essentially what he was saying in that was that modern humans, which in the West is kind of came out of the Enlightenment, Renaissance kind of thinking, the idea of history as progress, civilization as improving, technology as making life better and better for people, that person who came up with those ideas is obsolete because of Hiroshima. We need to develop a new kind of person who can think in a much more global and holistic way if we're going to survive having manufactured nuclear weapons. Now, for people like Cousins, who wrote this, in his lifetime, he had lived through World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. Suddenly, there's nuclear weapons. And at the end of World War II, people also learned about the Holocaust in Europe. So human beings were suddenly seeming to be capable of incredibly horrible actions and using technology for warfare and for mass murder. So part of the idea that Cousins had, and that was very widespread at the time, was that there was a gap between the technological abilities of human beings and their social adjustment to those technologies. Technology was moving very fast, but human beings were still fairly primitive. It was easy, as I said, for Cousins, who had gone through World War I and World War II, looking at nuclear weapons, to imagine there would be a World War III fought with these weapons, and that would be the end of civilization. So if human beings were going to be able to manage this technology, if human beings were going to be able to live with nuclear weapons without destroying themselves, they were going to have to evolve. So we were going to need a rapid evolution of human society and human social sciences to help human beings to better handle these new technologies without destroying themselves. In a typically direct way, this was stated by Albert Einstein. He said, "The real problem is in the hearts and minds of men. It is not a problem of physics, but of ethics. It is easier to denature plutonium than to denature the evil spirit of man." So we have the technological ability. We don't have the ethical capacity to live in the modern world. So something needs to be done to help human beings to adapt and to help human beings to evolve. Well, in part because the Soviet Union rather quickly developed nuclear weapons also, only 4 years after the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Cold War began. And you now had two adversaries squared off against each other, each of whom was building a bigger and a bigger nuclear arsenal. So in a way, many people forgot about the idea of trying to evolve human beings and began to really worry about how to survive the nuclear arms race of the Cold War. And eventually, these nuclear stockpiles would reach a scale during the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union possessing tens of thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at each other with increasingly sophisticated delivery systems. Well, among sort of academic discussion of nuclear weapons and their use by the United States, one of the first things that was discussed was, why did the United States use nuclear weapons in Japan? And the first real statement about that, why the bomb was, quote, dropped, the first real statement came from the US government, and that was from retired Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He had been the Secretary of War during World War II, so he had overseen the US military during the use of nuclear weapons against civilians. And there was some discussion about nuclear weapons being unethical, like chemical weapons, like biological weapons.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Can you please reshare your screen, as there was a technical glitch? So,
sure.
Yes.
Hold on one moment.
Okay, now it is okay, sir. Okay, sir. It is visible. Okay.
And so it still is?
Yeah, it is okay now, sir. You can see it.
Great. Thank you for letting me know. So Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, because there was discussion that nuclear weapons were inhumane and therefore the US was guilty of war crimes, he basically wrote an article explaining why we used the atomic bomb in 1947 in another very prominent US magazine, Harper's Magazine. And he said the things which have become, which are generally taught in schools in the United States, even till today. The first is that the nuclear attacks ended the war. So Hiroshima was attacked, Nagasaki was attacked, Japan surrendered. So therefore, the war ended because of the nuclear attacks. And because the war ended, that made an invasion of Japan by the United States military unnecessary. Since there was no invasion of Japan, that saved lives. It saved Japanese lives and American lives. Because if the United States Army had had to invade Japan, lots of people would have died in that invasion. And Henry Stimson claims in this article that 1 million soldiers, US soldiers, would have died in the invasion of Japan. No historian has been able to find any place where he got this number, so it's generally thought that he just made this number up. The estimates, the actual estimates by the US military of potential casualties if the US invaded Japan were under 100,000. But this is what people thought for a long time in the United States, that the bomb stopped the war and saved lives. Scholars began to analyze and take apart this argument about 20 years later. It took a while. And this book was a really key book, Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam. It was written by an American historian, Gar Alperovitz, and it was written in 1965, 20 years after the nuclear attacks. And he claims that the nuclear attacks were unnecessary to end the war, that the US was well aware at the time that Japan was seeking terms to surrender. The US's own study of the war, the atomic bombing, or rather the strategic bombing survey, claimed that Japan would have surrendered by November, even without any attack on Hiroshima or Nagasaki or any invasion. And that the reason that the United States used the nuclear weapons was to intimidate the Soviet Union. It wanted the Soviet Union to know that the US could destroy it. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were sacrificed in order to prove to the Soviet Union how powerful the United States was. So this is generally thought of as, among historians, this is the revisionist narrative, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were attacked not because of Japan, but because of the Soviet Union. Rather than looking at them as the last act of World War II, it's more proper to see them as the first act of the Cold War. Well, this is how scholarship began engaging with nuclear issues, was looking at the history and talking about the historical issues, but it moved fairly swiftly onto cultural topics. The United States and Japan had both seen lots of science fiction movies that were focused on nuclear weapons. And so one of the first and really seminal pieces was written in 1965 by cultural critic Susan Sontag, called The Imagination of Disaster. And it was essentially an analysis of nuclear movies, of nuclear iconography in movies, specifically in science fiction movies, monster movies, and also what are known as giant bug movies, which is bugs that become giant because of exposure to radiation and then attack human beings. Spiders, ants, caterpillars. There's so many of these movies, it's amazing. And what she argues is that we use these movies to live out our fear of nuclear weapons indirectly. We use these movies to express our fear, to try to express what would happen if cities were attacked by nuclear weapons. And we use monsters to stand in for nuclear weapons in these movies. And they reveal our inability to directly confront our fears and to directly confront our political and military situation, where a nuclear war could begin at any time. Maybe the most vividly obvious example of this is the Japanese movie Godzilla, which was 1954. Godzilla attacks Tokyo. Godzilla's breath is radioactive, and Godzilla destroys the city. So she talks about how movies like this.
Sorry to interrupt, sir.
Yeah.
Again, there is an issue with the screen. Can you please repeat the process of sharing the screen, sir? We can't see anything here.
So now do you see the whole screen or just the window?
Just the window, sir.
Okay.
Not the PPT.
So now can you see it? Oh wait, I have to reshare it, I suppose.
Please reshare, please, sir. Yeah.
Okay.
Now we can see the PPT, sir. The first page, in fact.
The first page?
No, that human beings are flawed. The photo of Einstein from 1946. That particular
Oh,
page.
okay. Huh. Hold on. I wonder why it's giving me trouble there.
Yeah, now it is okay, sir. The cultural analysis of nuclear weapons, the Godzilla. Okay.
Okay. And there's Godzilla.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Now.
So a lot of the original Nuclear Humanities work was about film and literature analysis of science fiction films, analysis of science fiction literature, and what it reflected back to us about our understanding of nuclear weapons. In the 1980s, a whole new group of nuclear humanities began. This book was one of the first books, By the Bomb's Early Light, which really looks at American thought and culture from 1945 until 1950. And this kind of scholarship in the 1980s was really distinct because all of these scholars were so worried about nuclear war. They were so worried about the end of the world that they saw their scholarship as a form of activism. Here in the introduction, can you see this quote?
You can see the cover.
Right. Paul Boyer, the author, writes, "This book will be read and judged by my professional peers as a piece of scholarship like any other. I hope it will not seem presumptuous to say that it is also intended as a contribution, however flawed, to the process by which we are again, at long last, trying to confront emotionally as well as intellectually the supreme menace of our age. So almost all of these nuclear humanities books in the 1980s have some claim that hopefully the author hopes that this work will help us to avoid nuclear war and help human civilization to survive. Well, needless to say, this is an unusual thing to read in scholarship. Imagine reading a book about, let's just say, early Middle Eastern history, or a book about the various kings and queens of England, or a book about, the early years of the Bollywood film industry, and imagine the author at the beginning saying, hopefully this book will help save the world. It's just not something that's said in academic works. It's not the way academics look at their work as a form of political activism, usually. But all of the nuclear humanities scholars in the 1980s all talked about how what they were trying to do was partly to help people to wake up and to fight against nuclear weapons and to avoid nuclear war. This kind of scholarship ended, though, with the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, this photo is the Berlin Wall coming down, symbolizing the end of the division between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Cold War, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And this period of time where the US and the Soviet Union appeared to be very close to nuclear war was over. And so the scholarship really shifted. And in a sense, rather than trying to save the world, scholarship on the Cold War, nuclear humanities became normal. It became like all other academic inquiries, which is that people looked at and studied various aspects of nuclear culture as it was applied to various humanities fields. And they did this the same way they might look at, for example, the kings and queens of England, or the origins of the Bollywood film industry, or any other topic that an academic is writing about. There was a way in which nuclear humanities scholars were freed to begin to act normally and not see their scholarship as a part of trying to save the world from nuclear warfare. And because of that, there's been a real flowering of nuclear humanities work, a real diversity of nuclear humanities work that emerged after the Cold War ended, and especially in the 21st century. And I'll talk about some of the different directions that went in a few minutes, but what I want to talk about now is the way my own work is situated in this post-Cold War's nuclear humanities new tradition, this new kind of scholarship that is no longer focused strictly on the US and the Soviet Union and the threat of gigantic nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. So my work is focused largely on what is called the global Hibakusha. Now, you remember the word Hibakusha was a Japanese word for somebody who survived Hiroshima and survived Nagasaki. Pardon me. Well, unfortunately, Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not the end of people being exposed to radiation from nuclear weapons. It was the beginning. Since then, millions of people all over the world have been exposed to radiation. Nobody has been directly attacked with a nuclear weapon the way the people in Hiroshima and the people in Nagasaki were, but lots of people have been exposed to radiation. And so those people are known in scholarship as the global Hibakusha. In other words, the people who have experienced exposure to radiation worldwide, not just in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there's several key ways that people have been exposed to radiation. One of the most important is that there were over 2,000 nuclear weapons detonated since 1945. Less than a year after the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were already more nuclear weapons being detonated by the United States in the Marshall Islands. As I said, there have been 2,000 nuclear weapon tests. Many people have been exposed to radiation and radioactive fallout as a result of these tests, and many places in the world remain heavily contaminated from these tests. Uranium mining has exposed millions of people to radiation as well. Uranium miners are frequently exposed to significant amounts of radiation, and also the waste at uranium mines, which is in the form of tailings, uranium tailings. There are often thousands of tons of these tailings, this uranium waste, just piled up nearby uranium mines, and they seep into the water and into the soil and into the air of the areas nearby uranium mines. And people who live there, even after the mining has stopped, end up becoming exposed to radiation, internalizing radiation inside of their bodies, and becoming sick. Nuclear production is another key way that people are exposed. For example, once uranium is taken out of the ground, you cannot just use that uranium for nuclear weapons or for nuclear power. It has to be heavily refined and heavily enriched. So the process of taking the uranium that's already out of the ground, turning it into powder, making it into a usable form, and then when you mine uranium from the ground, less than 1% of it is the kind of uranium, the isotope, uranium-235, that's useful for nuclear weapons, or that can release energy when it fissions, that's useful as the basic part of nuclear fuel for nuclear power plants. So in order to get that less than 1% into a high enough concentration that you can use a weapon or you can use a nuclear power plant, there has to be very, very heavy industrial enrichment of that uranium. So the period of time from when uranium is mined to when uranium can be used is, at least, is many, many months, and it goes through many, many industrial processes. Every stage of that is a place where people are exposed to radiation. The people who live in the communities where this happens, the people who live where the waste is discarded. One of the key things for use in nuclear weapons is plutonium. And the way that you make plutonium is that you operate nuclear power plants. Many people think that first there were nuclear weapons, and then later we made nuclear power plants for the peaceful atom. But actually, nuclear power plants were invented before nuclear weapons. Nuclear power plants were a key part of making nuclear weapons. Nuclear power plants were invented to make plutonium. That's how you make plutonium. You operate a nuclear power plant, and some of the uranium in the fuel rods converts to plutonium. And then you extract that plutonium and use it for weapons. So every nation that has nuclear weapon program has a military reactor program, military nuclear power plants that are used to manufacture plutonium. These sites are among the most radioactive places in the world, especially where the United States and the Soviet Union, which had the largest arsenals of nuclear weapons, where they produced their plutonium, those communities are incredibly polluted with radioactive waste, and there's massive amounts of radioactive waste sitting in tanks and in buildings in these cities waiting for disposal. There's incredibly high cancer rates in the communities around them. So these people are people who are exposed to radiation as well. During the nuclear tests, many soldiers took part in nuclear tests. Over 1 million soldiers altogether between the various nuclear nations have taken part in nuclear tests. Those soldiers, most of them have been exposed to serious amounts of radiation. Also, nuclear accidents at power plants, like at Chernobyl or in Fukushima, have exposed millions more to radiation. and also contaminated very large areas where people may be exposed to radiation in the future. And finally, nuclear waste disposal. Every stage of the nuclear fuel cycle, from mining to milling and refining uranium, to making either weapons or fuel rods, to operating nuclear power plants or testing nuclear weapons, to disposing of these things, every stage creates incredibly highly toxic waste, much of it that is dangerous for tens of thousands of years. So all of the areas where this waste is stored, people are exposed to radiation, and places where this waste will be permanently stored, people in the future are at risk from being exposed to radiation. So these communities collectively are the global Hibakusha. There are millions and millions of people all around the world who are global Hibakusha. So I'll look a little bit at where some of the key sites are, and then also at some of the ways that human beings have been impacted by this. As I said, there were over 2,000 nuclear weapon tests. Here you can see all of the sites where nuclear weapons have been tested in the world. Nuclear weapons have been tested on every continent except for Antarctica and South America. There's been serious nuclear weapon testing in each continent. Here are some numbers to give you a more solid idea. So the place with the most nuclear tests on Earth is Nevada in the United States, over 900 nuclear weapon tests. The primary testing site of the Soviet Union was Kazakhstan, almost 500 nuclear tests. The United States, there's a couple things about nuclear weapons I should mention quickly. One is that there's a difference between what are called A bombs and H bombs, atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. Hydrogen bombs are also called thermonuclear weapons. They use a different process to release energy. On a regular nuclear weapon, like the kind in Hiroshima, splits the atom. It splits the nucleus of an atom and releases the energy that binds the nucleus together. It's one of the primary energies in the universe called the strong force. It binds the nucleus of the atom together. When an atom is split, that energy is released. When you do that to trillions of atoms at once, this is a nuclear weapon. A thermonuclear weapon, or a hydrogen bomb, uses a totally different principle. And that is that instead of fission, instead of splitting an atom, it uses fusion, which fuses two atoms into one. And that's how the energy is released. Now, even before we made nuclear weapons, we knew about this because this is how stars work. All of the light and the heat that you're feeling today coming from the sun is because of nuclear fusion. There's nuclear fusion burning in the sun. So we knew that this was a way to release energy. And less than 10 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we learned how to make weapons using this principle. These weapons are thousands of times larger than the nuclear weapons that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Literally thousands of times larger. As a result, they release an incredibly large amount of radiation. The very first nuclear weapon, thermonuclear weapon that the US tested, the US government projected that if that weapon had been detonated over Washington, D.C., first of all, the weapon would have destroyed Washington, D.C., but the radioactive fallout cloud would have killed everybody in Philadelphia, everybody in Baltimore, and 50% of the population of New York City. So the fallout cloud from one hydrogen bomb was estimated to be able to kill tens of millions of people. The US and the UK and France tested all of their hydrogen bombs in the Pacific on small islands. Here in French Polynesia, the French tested over 200 nuclear weapons, many of them hydrogen bombs. So there's a difference between hydrogen bombs and regular bombs, and also there's a difference between nuclear weapons being detonated in the atmosphere or underground. Nuclear weapons detonated in the atmosphere spread much, much more radioactive fallout on the wind. It spreads sometimes thousands of miles away from where the nuclear test was. When nuclear weapons are tested underground, that radiation doesn't spread. It's still there. It's just in the soil where the test site is. So it spreads slowly through groundwater and through plants and through mechanisms, geological mechanisms, rather than the wind. So even though most nuclear testing went underground in 1963, that just contains the radiation in one place. It doesn't remove the radiation. But the testing in the atmosphere spread radiation all around the world. As I said, there were over 2,000 nuclear weapon tests. 90% of these were the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States and the Soviet Union have always been crazier than all the other countries. Even today, their nuclear arsenals were at one time as big as 70,000 weapons. Today, they're reduced down to about 5,000 or 6,000 nuclear weapons. They still possess, I believe it's still over 90% of all of the nuclear weapons in the world today. There were years when nuclear testing reached over 140 weapons in 1 year. Statistically, in the Cold War, a nuclear weapon was being detonated every 8.6 days. That's how many nuclear tests there were in the Cold War. So we think of the Cold War as a period of time when nuclear weapons didn't get used, but in reality, there were nuclear weapons detonating continually throughout the Cold War. So people in the United States, people in the Soviet Union were not attacked directly. However, many, many people were affected by this radiation. This is what I study in the Global Hibakusha project with a colleague from Australia, Dr. Mick Broderick. And so what we look at is how all of these communities around the world have been impacted by this history. We don't look at the medical impacts. Most of these communities are neglected, and when they are looked at, what's looked at is the incidence of cancer in these communities. We look at how the communities have changed socially as a result of people being exposed to radiation, how families have changed, how culture has changed, how their politics have changed. And so we look at these legacies of radiation exposure, the non-epidemiological legacies. We look at everything besides the medical legacies. So I'll talk a little bit about what these are. I mean, of course, the experience of the global hibakusha, the primary one is of sickness and death. This is obviously what matters to people, is that they get sick and they have early mortality. These, remember when I talked about that first hydrogen bomb test by the United States that could have killed tens of millions of people? These are some of the people that actually were affected by that test. These are children from the Marshall Islands that were downwind from where this test was conducted. There was an island, there were several atolls downwind from Bikini Atoll where the weapon was tested, and all of the people on these atolls were exposed to incredibly high levels of radiation. So for example, these children were on an atoll called Rongelap. It was 120 kilometers from where the test was. Their levels of radiation exposure were the same as somebody who was 2.5 kilometers from ground zero in Nagasaki. So even though they were 120 kilometers away, their exposures to radiation were very high, and almost everybody in these communities became sick. So this is the clear impact. I don't want to ignore it, but this isn't what we research ourselves. We look at other things. One of the key things that happened to a lot of people is colonial displacement and loss of land. There's one of the a key field of study within nuclear humanities is what's called nuclear colonialism. England never detonated a nuclear weapon inside England. France never detonated a nuclear weapon inside France. They detonated their weapons in either colonial or post-colonial locations. The United States and the Soviet Union did test inside their own countries, but the United States never tested a hydrogen bomb inside the US, in Nevada. All the hydrogen bombs were tested in the Pacific. The Soviet Union selected, even when a country conducts atmospheric testing inside its own nation, it selects a population that is a marginal population of a different ethnicity or a different religion to be near the nuclear test site. So in the Soviet Union, that was Kazakhs. They tested these weapons in Kazakhstan, where the population was Muslim. This is true in China as well. China tested its nuclear weapons near the Uyghur population in the far west of China, the Muslim population that is still undergoing seriously brutal treatment by the Chinese government today. So the people that are selected to be irradiated in many ways are colonial populations or poor or marginal populations, people who can't stop this from happening to them. Here we see people of the Marshall Islands. This is in 1946, and the United States government is explaining to the people of Bikini Atoll that they need to take their land away from them because they want to use it to test a weapon that will bring world peace. Well, instead, they completely irradiated Bikini Atoll, and these people can never return. So these people have lost their property, they've lost their homes, they've lost a lot of their belongings. So many people who have been exposed to radiation at nuclear test sites are then removed from their homes, and they become refugees living without their property, without property they can pass on to their children, living in somebody else's land, where they're always outsiders. So this is one of the social impacts, this nuclear colonialism of people who experience this. You can see this too with nuclear power plants. For example, at Fukushima power plants were located in a very rural agricultural area. Those people were not using the electricity from the power plants. The electricity was going to Tokyo. But they don't put the power plants in Tokyo because if something goes wrong, they don't want it to affect so many people, and they don't want it to affect a place of commerce. So they put it out in farmland where when Fukushima happens, when a disaster happens, the people who are affected are people who are not engaged in important business, people who want the jobs, who don't mind there being a toxic plant where they're located. So there's always a way in which marginal communities are where these places are located. And when it comes to nuclear testing, colonial spaces for the most part. Many people have their food sources contaminated. So there is not just exposure to radiation, but there's ongoing exposure to radiation. This is a farm in Kazakhstan, near the nuclear test site in Kazakhstan, where scientists are trying to see if it's possible to grow edible food in that soil. This is a scientific plot, but nearby here are 40 villages where the people just simply grow food and eat it. They don't have the luxury to wait for the tests. Since 1949, nuclear weapons have been tested near their villages. Third and fourth generations of people now have grown up eating contaminated food in the villages near the test site in Kazakhstan. So for some people, there's ongoing contamination, there's ongoing health problems. Some of the radiation that is in the soil is taken up by the plants. So even people born today in Kazakhstan will be exposed to radiation because of the nuclear testing that stopped in the 90s. For other communities, there's dramatic changes in diet. So for example, for the Marshallese, the people in the Marshall Islands, or some of the people in French Polynesia or in other locations where the soil is contaminated, what ends up happening is that food is brought in by the colonizing power. So now in the Marshall Islands, people eat, in many parts of the Marshall Islands, where people can't fish anymore, they eat canned food. They eat processed food brought in by the United States. So this change in diet has brought an increase in diabetes, and it's brought a reduction of traditional self-reliant cultures. And that's one of the key things that gets lost, is traditional knowledge, traditional ways of living, traditional ways of providing food, traditional ways of maintaining land, traditional ways that communities are organized. This is in Australia, where the British tested. They left a sign here to let people who live out in the outback know that there's a radiation hazard here. When they left this sign in the 1950s, the people who lived there could not read English. So this sign did nobody any good. People continued to live in these contaminated areas. And then eventually they were moved off of their land. And that caused all kinds of cultural breakdowns. So for example, in the outback in Australia, it's a very, very dry desert environment. It's a very difficult place to live ecologically. The British took people who were living at the test site and they said to themselves, well, these are people who live in the desert. So they just moved them 200 kilometers over and figured, there, they know how to live in the desert. Well, those people knew how to live in that specific place. They'd been living in that specific place for a long time, and they had knowledge from their ancestors about where to find water at different times of year, the migration habits of animals, when to hunt certain animals, where to hunt certain animals. And if you take people that have knowledge that is thousands of years old, gained from ancestors, that are used to keep a community alive, and you move them 200 kilometers over, they have no knowledge of how the water and the migration of animals works there. So you are breaking a chain that is thousands of years old, that has been passed down from one generation to another generation, showing people how, giving people the tools to survive. So when that chain is broken, people become dependent on the government for processed food, for housing, and it ends up having a very serious impact on the culture, cultural practices, and the ability of people to pass a thriving and viable culture onto their descendants. And some people, like those people in Kazakhstan, remain on contaminated land. This is the test site in Nevada. This is outside of a uranium mine on Navajo land in the United States. And people, there was a recent study in the United States in Arizona that found that 25% of the people living on a Navajo reservation had uranium inside their bodies, even though the uranium mining stopped 30 years ago. So there's continued exposure to people even after the mining stops. So as you can see, altogether, there are just thousands and thousands, or millions and millions of people all around the world who have been exposed to radiation and continue to live in radioactive environments. Among these people, even if you don't get sick, you don't know if you're going to. There's lifelong anxiety. Here in Hiroshima, when I see an elderly person, I think that person survived the attack. And I think it's wonderful that they got to live a long life. But they probably didn't expect that they were going to live to be 80 years old. Probably every time they got a fever, every time they had a nosebleed, every time their children got sick, they thought, here it is. The radiation is finally coming to get me. It's finally coming to get my children. So there's an anxiety that comes for people, even if they don't get sick, because they know they've been exposed to radiation. They know they live in a place that's contaminated with radiation. These are people from Nagasaki. These are people in a village in Kazakhstan near the test site. These are people from a small Pacific island called Christmas Island, where both the British and the US tested hydrogen bombs. And so they know they live with a lot of radiation, and they know that it could easily make any of them or their children or their grandchildren sick at any time. So these studies look at this global Hibakusha studies that I work on. It looks at nuclear colonialism and post-colonialism. It looks at how science and health studies are used politically. In other words, the way that science studies are used to tell people, oh, there's no risk from radiation, or the radiation levels here are safe. So it looks at the political use of science. It looks at the health impacts to lots of different types of people, like the people who lived near the test sites, the soldiers who took part in the tests. It looks at the way communities change, the way that traditional cultures erode and cultures have to become adapted to a toxic technological world. looks at radiological impacts of the ecosystem. It looks at how people remember this stuff, nuclear memory practices. How is this memory held? What happened to these communities? How do they pass this on to young people? And it also looks at deep time issues related to nuclear waste, because nuclear waste will remain dangerous for well over 100,000 years. So as you can see, just in this work on global Hibakusha, which is a form of nuclear humanities study, there's a wide range of different ways in which we use methodologies and traditions of both social science and humanities inquiry to look into the lived reality of nuclear technologies, people who have lived with nuclear technologies and how it has affected them and their culture and their psychology. So this is just an example of the kind of ways that nuclear humanities can function. But I'll show you some other examples of how post-Cold War nuclear humanities is doing diverse and interesting work. Here's work on French nuclear colonialism in the Pacific. So this is political work. It's looking at the specific colonialism of the French who tested in French Polynesia, which is essentially still a French colony. It's under a slightly different status, but it is controlled by France. Here's an inquiry into music and the atomic bomb on American television in the 1950s. So this is the kind of long tradition of looking at cultural studies, at art, at film, music, TV, as a place in which nuclear representation taught people various things about nuclear issues and also represented different interests, political interests. There's a look at the way that nuclear issues affected different groups for various reasons. In this case, in terms of various racial differences, this is how African Americans reacted to nuclear weapons and anti-nuclear activism in the United States. This extends throughout the world. Here's an important inquiry into South Asian cultures of the bomb in India and Pakistan, both public and state representations. This is an architectural history, and this is a way to use fallout shelters in the United States, which were built for people to take shelter during nuclear war, and shows the way in which it expresses class differences, racial differences, gender roles. So it's using the preparation for nuclear war to look at all kinds of various ways in which people in America were separated into who is worth saving, who is not worth saving, what roles do various kinds of people play in the post-nuclear world. And gender is a key place. The roles of women in relation to nuclear weapons and nuclear technologies has been essential. This particular project looks at how radiation affects female bodies. Female bodies are affected far more seriously than male bodies by radiation, but all studies about the impact of radiation on human bodies that set standards for exposure are based on adult males. And so this looks at the impact of studies on radiation exposures and gender. Well, now I want to talk about one final thing, just to show you the centrality of the humanities to all of this kind of inquiry around nuclear technologies, and that is to look at the waste. Nuclear weapons and nuclear power create waste that people need to be protected from for hundreds of thousands of years. It remains deadly for hundreds of thousands of years. By the way, I have a blank screen right now. So I'll start by looking at spent nuclear fuel. Spent nuclear fuel, this is what is used inside nuclear reactors to make plutonium for weapons, and it's also what's used to give us power from nuclear power plants. So these are nuclear fuel rods. They're put into their individual rods and they're put into an assembly like this. And these are inside a nuclear power plant. This is what generates energy. And this is where plutonium is manufactured inside of this. And then plutonium is extracted. Now, spent nuclear fuel is used for about 3 years inside a nuclear power plant. But it will remain incredibly dangerous for over 100,000 years. So for 100,000 years, this waste needs to be protected from human beings. How do we do something that lasts 100,000 years? Right now, it's all just sitting mostly in big pools of water, waiting. There's hundreds of thousands of metric tons of this, waiting to be put into final disposal. None of it has been put in any final disposal yet. Basically, the only thing we can think of to do with these hundreds of thousands of metric tons of incredibly toxic materials is to bury it underground and hope that nobody gets hurt. So we have what are called permanent deep geological disposal. This is an illustration of a site being built in Sweden. So basically, a half a kilometer underground, there are all of these tunnels built with holes where canisters holding the nuclear fuel will be placed. Once that's full, it will be filled with clay all the way up to the top, and then it will be left there. Hopefully, it will stay there for 100,000 years, and it will never leak, and nobody will ever dig it up. Well, we need to try to figure out how to tell people that it's dangerous there, that there's toxic materials there, and that they shouldn't dig there. This is a really big problem. How do you communicate to people 20,000 years from now? This is a problem that is called nuclear semiotics, and it's about how to build nuclear markers. In other words, how to mark a place to let people in the future know there's highly toxic material here. So these are some of the key points. This is a sign, for example, that was developed to be placed at this site. This place is not a place of honor. Nothing is valued here. What is here is dangerous. This is a warning about danger. But we know that language will only work for a little while. If somebody came up to us from 5,000 years ago and spoke to us, we wouldn't know what they were saying. It takes us a long time to decipher languages that are older than a few hundred years. We haven't deciphered languages that are older than several thousand years. So just writing danger, danger, danger isn't really enough. So how do we communicate to people in deep time? This problem is a problem that is mostly being worked on by humanities and social science scholars. There's a wide range of people on the task forces that work on this, from artists to semioticians to literature studies and culture studies to psychologists, anthropologists. So these particular skills are all central to how to communicate into deep time. And there's two ideas. One is we have lots of information panels that tell people to stay away. But we know that that really won't work for very long. So one of the other things we think of is to make big, scary things that when they see it, they'll go, oh, this is terrible. This is like a bad place. So this is like one rendition of a giant field of dangerous spikes to be built above a nuclear storage site. But of course, people realize that this is a fascinating thing and this may draw people and people may wonder what's there. Pirates used to put skull and crossbones to warn people of danger to stay away from their treasure. But after a while, people realized that it doesn't mean danger, it means treasure. People may look at something like this and think, ooh, there's treasure there. So how on earth is it that we communicate? Maybe we'll be successful at this, maybe we won't be successful at this, but this is the kind of problem where even giant nuclear industries and militaries are turning to people in the humanities and social sciences to try to figure out. Because one of the things that they have slowly understood is that nuclear technologies don't just take place in the present. Nuclear technologies continue to happen for tens of thousands of years. They take place in deep time. Even the very notion of deep time, the notion of things that go past when our languages will last, these are ideas that are not scientific ideas. They require people with an understanding of culture, people with an understanding of communication, people with an understanding of psychology. So that's the gist of what I wanted to present to you, was these changes in the way that humanities have studied nuclear issues, from trying to save the world to trying to study how people think about this, how the politics of it have functioned, and then back to trying to save the world again in the future, to save the people in the future. So nuclear humanities is a field that is unlike other fields in its sense of mission and its sense of responsibility to human civilization as a whole. So thank you for putting up with those glitches in the presentation, and happy to chat and hear your thoughts and have any questions at this point.
Well, on behalf of all of us, those of us who have listened spellbound to you, I must thank Professor Jacobs for this wonderful presentation. Yes, there have been some technical glitches, but they are negligible. You know, one of the Russian musics, a farmer, had once told Maxim Gorky that we have learned to fly like a bird in the air and swim like a fish in the water, but we don't know how to live on this earth.
That's the truth.
This is what nuclear energy, especially nuclear weapons, have done to us. Even though we cannot ignore that much of our energy needs have been fulfilled by nuclear energy, but all the same, responsibility is the name of the game. And Professor Jacobs has given us a wonderful lowdown on this particular field of nuclear humanities. We have learned with him and from him about the Marshall Islands and the Yukon Mountain, from Murarua Atoll to Pokhran. We have visited virtually the sites where nuclear tests have been done, where nuclear waste have been dumped, and how toxic and how inimical to civilization this nuclear waste may be, not only today, but unthinkable eons from now. So I think this presentation will help all of us to widen our mental horizons. And without further ado, let me now throw this session open for questions and comments. As always, Dr. Shomipendra Banerjee, one of my esteemed colleagues from the Department of English, University of Gaurbanga, is going to moderate the questions. So it's over to you, Shomipendra.
Yes, thank you, Professor Amit Bhattacharya and Professor Jacobs. It was wonderful listening to you. I'll have my own questions as well, but there are some questions that have already arrived in the chat box. Both of these are from our postgraduate students. Preeti Shaha is asking, I mean, okay, she is saluting you in Japanese and arigato gozaimasu, sensei. And yeah, I also used to know a little bit of Japanese. Anyway, my question is, after so many years of war, do we still need nuclear weapons? Does it really help in preventing war? That's it.
That's an excellent question, and I would say, I mean, I have fairly strong opinions. Absolutely, we don't need nuclear weapons. One of the reasons that they've not been used in war since 1945 is that they are militarily useless. You cannot really achieve military goals with nuclear weapons. The U.S. considered using them in Korea, in Vietnam, in many conflicts. The Soviets thought about using them in various conflicts. It's never been militarily understood that you could really achieve military goals with a nuclear weapon. For example, if the United States had used nuclear weapons in Vietnam, that probably wouldn't have ended the war and saved lives. It would have created a lot of destruction, and the war would simply have continued. And the US would be chastised for its use of these weapons. So they have not succeeded in accomplishing anything militarily, so they're not useful for war. Their main use is to prevent the use of nuclear weapons, right? Deterrence. This is the theory of what they're useful for, is that if you have nuclear weapons, you prevent somebody else from attacking you with nuclear weapons. And that is something that, there's two things I'd say about that. The countries that have used them for deterrence, for example, my country, the United States, we have had a massive nuclear arsenal in order to deter war, but we have inflicted radioactive illnesses on millions of people in the name of stopping that war, of stopping the use of nuclear weapons. So people have still been harmed just by the manufacture of nuclear weapons and the testing of nuclear weapons. But deterrence, to speak directly to deterrence, deterrence is something that works until the day it doesn't work. And then it doesn't matter how many days it worked before that. So if you have two people who each have a gun to the other person's head, and they're pretty sure that the best way not to get shot in the head is to keep a gun pointed at the head of the other person, that works until it doesn't work. It seems that there's probably much better ways to avoid being shot in the head than to hold a gun to someone else's head. So getting rid of nuclear weapons would be a quicker way to avoiding being attacked by nuclear weapons. So I don't find that there's any use for nuclear weapons at all. And I would also say that one of the main reasons that countries have nuclear weapons is for political status, and also because of the immense amount of public money that can be moved from taxation into nuclear weapon industries. That was the case in my country, and certainly in the Soviet Union as well. So I don't find nuclear weapons to have any use at all.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, in a way, I think the nuclear weapon is a symbol in itself, isn't it? I mean, it symbolizes the power that you may wield rather than, you know, directly use it. And Rajkumar Tarafdar's question is about the attitude of the common people of Japan towards America now. Yeah. Is it still full of kind of hatred, or has it changed?
No, as a matter of fact, it almost never was hatred. I mean, obviously, there is some hatred towards the United States for people who lost family members during the war. But the United States became the occupier of Japan, and Japan has had an alliance with the United States essentially since the end of that occupation in 1952. So in general, Japanese people love Americans. I live in Hiroshima. People always say, we don't blame America. We just want to see the abolition of nuclear weapons. So the position is often that we're not looking at the past with blame. We're looking towards the future with hope. And Japanese people were raised with American movies, American television, American music. And for the most part, they really love Americans. The animosities in Japan are towards its traditional close at hand enemies. For example, there's a lot of animosity towards Korean people, towards Chinese people. They're treated much worse than Americans are. And so there's a way in which many Japanese people believe that the post-war affluence of Japan directly came from its alliance with the United States. So there's not a lot of anti-American feeling in Japan.
Yes, thank you. Onik Dash is a research scholar at our department. Sir, if you can kindly mention about the social discrimination that the Japanese Hibakusha survivors had to face? Thank you.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There was really terrible discrimination against the Hibakusha in Japan. For example, people did not want to marry them. People were sure that they would have deformed children or children with disease. So it was very difficult for Hibakusha to get married. People did not want to give them jobs. They thought that they would be more sick than other employees, more tired than other employees, less productive than other employees. And immediately after the war, nobody really understood radiation. So people thought you might be able to get sick because you were near a Hibakusha. So there was tremendous social discrimination against Hibakusha in Japan, especially in the first 10 and 20 years after the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And some of that continues in other sites. Children from Fukushima that evacuated and were in schools in other places were discriminated against and called contaminated and radioactive and dirty and things like that. But the suffering of the Hibakusha here in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the discrimination against them was really vivid. There were a lot of people that tried to hide the fact that they were in Hiroshima or Nagasaki at the time of the nuclear attack, and many people moved away from Hiroshima and Nagasaki so that they wouldn't be clear to other people that they were from here. So it was pretty intense. But now it's changed, and Hibakusha are esteemed members of the community, and their opinions are sought out. So there has been a shift.
Yes, yes. Thank you. That was an interesting question. And yeah, so far in the chat box, these are the 3 questions. I had a few questions. I mean, I was listening to you attentively. Number 1 is the movie that came across my mind was Chernobyl, the HBO miniseries.
Yeah.
And it was so it was so powerful. It was so touching, and I thought that what was important about this particular movie was the way in which it showed or portrayed the lives that were impacted in different ways, rather than the nuclear damage in itself. So, I mean, would such movies also be a part of the disciplinary inquiries related to nuclear humanities?
Oh, absolutely. You bet. There's already a lot of scholarship about the HBO series Chernobyl. So those kinds of things, absolutely, partly because nuclear issues are so political, any representation of them is immediately politically situated. And so some people will attack it and other people will champion it. But that kind of representation is really important. There's a lot of cultural representation of Chernobyl. There's a lot of documentaries about Chernobyl. There's a lot of references to Chernobyl. For example, there's a lot of news that tries to help us to understand nuclear things through Chernobyl. For example, recently there's been some press about wildlife returning to the exclusion zone in Chernobyl, and that the presence of wolves or the presence of bears there demonstrates that it's not as dangerous as we thought. So there's ways that media representations of Chernobyl are always politically charged, and that TV show is certainly, as successful as it was, it's created sort of the largest cultural imprint for Chernobyl, and so it's incredibly important in this kind of field.
Yes, thank you. Yes, but then Professor Jacobs, the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. I mean, do you think the similar kind of media attention has been given to this particular incident compared to Chernobyl?
No, and there's really clear reasons for that. There's a way in which Chernobyl happening in the Soviet Union at the very end of the Cold War had a real political utility. Even in that show, Chernobyl, the HBO show, one of the basic subtexts is that part of the problem was the government trying to keep everything secret and the government not being open about what was really going on. And this is because this is a Soviet style system where there's a repression of information and control from the top, and individuals who dissent are repressed. And that's one of the reasons Chernobyl was so bad. Well, the very same thing happened at Fukushima. All of those exact same things. The government really repressed information. It suppressed voices that said things, that passed laws making it punishable with jail time if you criticized government policies in Fukushima. So many of the very same things were done by the government of Japan, but it doesn't have the same cultural imprint because it reflects back to those of us in capitalist countries, our own system. And so it's much harder to criticize it in the same way that Chernobyl, we criticized it because it was other. It was the system of our enemies. So in Fukushima, it's the government of Japan. I mean, right now, I'm in Japan and the Olympics are just about to begin. Those Olympics were secured by the government of Japan in 2013, 2 years after Fukushima. It took the government of Japan 6 months to stop lying about the fact that there had been nuclear meltdowns. So 2 years into it, with the situation still in chaos and with hundreds of thousands of people in temporary housing, the last thing the government needed to do was to commit these gigantic resources to getting an Olympics and staging an Olympics game in Tokyo, and having all of the large construction companies in the country focus on Olympic venues rather than rebuilding Fukushima. So the government of Japan has been very active at trying to neutralize negative perceptions about Fukushima and trying to, right now, these Olympics are the recovery Olympics. So unlike the Soviet Union, which collapsed soon after Chernobyl and which was seen as a corrupt and flawed political system, in Fukushima, it's a system that reflects our own systems back at us. So there's much less criticism and it's much harder to culturally depict it. So the depictions we have at this point are, there's a movie coming out about the Fukushima 50, the people who stayed and put themselves at risk to get the reactors under control. And they're heroic narratives, and there's really not the same critical narratives that there were around Chernobyl. So it's in the long run, we don't know exactly how it will. And, 30 years later, it's, quite a bit longer after Chernobyl.
Yes. I mean, that was a wonderful response. Thank you. Just one last thing, maybe, if I, have your permission. I was also wondering, about the historiographical questions, of this discipline as such. So, how do you, construct the historiography? Is it a later kind of thought and a search for a history that has emerged now, or it was always there? Because the term is new. Yeah.
Well, there really is a threshold during the Cold War and post-Cold War. And during the Cold War, there was a really intact historiography of discussions about the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what they say about human beings and what they say about the Cold War and the behavior of the governments of the US and Soviet Union, and the way that the movies reflect fears that couldn't be spoken about openly. But after the end of the Cold War, there really became this flowering of nuclear humanities. And so it's now moved off into so many subfields that the historiography is, in a sense, sort of reforming itself. So you have art history around it. You have, as I mentioned, architectural history. You have post-colonial studies. So there's you have a wide range of science and technology studies doing critical work. So rather than, it's not necessarily at this point an intact historiography so much as it is a plant that's has shoots going off into multiple directions. So it's really in a period of formation right now. My own subfield, my field of global Hibakusha, when I began working in this, there was hardly anybody working in this field at all. But now there's a robust scholarship in multiple sites around the world of people doing work like this. And so So the Cold War period has a very intact historiography, kind of a the classic works that must be read and the classic fields, schools of thought, and what their arguments were. But the post-Cold War world is really kind of wide open and being expanded as we speak. So it has yet to sort of solidify. I mean, there are certain works that are often looked to discussing nuclear issues, but it's still very much a growing and emerging field.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's one more question in the chat box. Can I take that? I mean,
certainly.
Yeah, Polash Bishash's question. What are the roles that are being played by different peace organizations in the nuclear disarmament process at the global level? That's what he wants to know.
Well, right now, the primary thrust is the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This came out of a series of conferences on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, and it ended up with this treaty being negotiated in the United Nations, the treaty then being ratified last year by the United Nations. So the focus very much of disarmament groups globally is on the implementation of this treaty right now. And there is discussion and debate about strategies. I mean, it's modeled on treaties, for example, the treaty against chemical weapons, the prohibition of landmines, cluster bombs. And so there's strategies that there are ways to implement this that can be effective over time. There are other groups that say none of the nuclear weapon states have signed on. Not one nuclear weapon has been reduced since the treaty came into force. So a lot of the focus of the disarmament community and the NGOs working on disarmament are all around the treaty, the various strategies and provisions of the treaty. So that's really the central piece. And there's also, to the side of that, I would just mention, there's also a very, very strong and energetic debate and argument going on about the potential role of nuclear power in the future. Is it a means of combating global warming, or is it not? Or is it a technology that brings more risk and long-term burden than it does help? So that's a separate issue than the weapons issue, but there is a very, very engaged debate around that as well.
Well, Professor Jacob, I have a question.
Yes.
In the brief outline of the lecture that you had provided me with, you were talking about one point that was global warming and nuclear winter.
Yes.
Could you shed some light on that?
Thank you very much. I actually realized when I got to the end of it that I had not specifically talked about nuclear winter, which is a critically important point. And it reflects really all of these other questions about nuclear weapons. The idea of nuclear winter was an idea that was first put forward by scientists in the 1980s. And that is that if there was a large nuclear war, this would create so much smoke that it would block out the sky, that it would circle the Earth and it would block out the sun, and that this would cause a dramatic cooling of the world and a failure of agriculture. This was modeled on volcanoes. When there have been very, very large volcanic eruptions, there has been enough particles put into the atmosphere that it filtered the sunlight and created, there were some years following large eruptions that were called the year without a summer, where there was no warmth at all because of the particulates just from one volcanic eruption. So the theory was that if there was a real big nuclear war, it would create a nuclear winter. This was in the 1980s when the science was not very advanced. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up is that the science is now very advanced. And I'm really grateful you give me this opportunity to get to it after having not done it myself. Because there's so much work done on climate science now, there's so much work done on global warming, our understanding of the dynamics of climate, the dynamics of how the climate operates are very sophisticated compared to the 1980s. And we now know without a doubt that what would be called a small exchange of nuclear weapons, and by that I mean 10 nuclear weapons in a nuclear war, would be sufficient to cause this effect to happen. And so frequently, South Asia is used as a model. If there was a small nuclear war between India and Pakistan, an exchange of, say, 5 or 6 weapons on either side, there are lots of studies now detailing specifically that scenario that show that what would happen as a result of that is that there would be so much smoke that it would block sunlight globally for at least 10 years. And this would lead to the failure of most agriculture globally and the starvation of billions. So this is one of the ways in which whatever protection nuclear weapons offer, the threats they pose are apocalyptic. They're so catastrophic that it's hard to see any value to them. So nuclear winter, which was something spoken about towards the end of the Cold War, is now something absolutely understood as almost inevitable if there is an exchange, a small nuclear exchange, not a giant nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. And so this puts even more of a burden on us to abolish nuclear weapons, because the threat to all living creatures, regardless of their nationality, politics, location, is potentially apocalyptic. So if anybody wants to, anybody is welcome to contact me, and I am happy to send you links to the studies about nuclear winter that show these climate models and show how this would work. And it's unfortunately far more dire of a risk than was thought of in the 1980s, where it was thought that a large nuclear exchange was necessary to trigger this. And then global warming, to speak about global warming, one of the ways that, for myself, I am very much opposed to nuclear technologies at all. And one of the reasons that I'm opposed to them is because of the burdens they place on future generations. So when we look at nuclear power, for example, nuclear power plants, the people who gain any benefit at all from nuclear power plants are 2 generations of people or 3 generations of people at the most. But they place a burden of, a catastrophic burden of the most toxic materials on Earth for 1,000 generations of people. All we think of to do with this stuff is to bury it underground, which is really not a way to contain something for millennia, for hundreds of thousands of years. Nuclear power plants are not able to be built quick enough to fix climate change. Nuclear power plants, from the time you decide to build them to the time that they are up and operating, typically has been 10 to 20 years. In order to replace coal plants, we would need several coming online every month, even every week, in order to replace them. It's not really a feasible way to replace coal or to replace fossil fuels within 20 years or 30 years. And what's more, it is not carbon neutral. It's only carbon neutral in the sense that during the operation of the plant, its carbon footprint is very small. But the carbon footprint of mining uranium, of milling uranium, of building gigantic underground storage sites, the site in Finland, the Onkalo site, which many people may have seen in the movie Into Eternity, it shows the deep underground storage. This is a site to house the waste of 5 nuclear power plants, and it is a 100-year construction project. So the carbon footprint of a 100-year construction project, drilling and excavating an entire city underground, that's a massive carbon footprint. So it's really not carbon neutral. And what's more, I would say too, it replicates a broken system, which is centralized production of power that is then distributed throughout a gigantic grid. When we were younger, we made phone calls by picking the phone up, and the call went to a central office, and a person there connected it to the other place. So there was a centralization to the way that this operated. This is the way that our electricity operates right now. But the way we make phone calls now is that there's a system that's distributed across a gigantic area, and there is no central location everything has to go through. And this is most likely to be the functional model for electricity in the future, is renewable sources producing everywhere and contributing to a small local grid, power being stored through batteries. This is a way in which, first of all, that's a system that that is likely to be where we get to within 100 years or 200 years, no matter what we do, because it's just a more functional way to distribute, to use energy, to keep energy in a more local area instead of sending it out over lines from a huge production center. The huge production center replicates the electrical systems that utilities use now, which is giant production, control of giant production in the hands of one company, and distribution to customers from there. So there's an economic reason these companies are against the idea of a decentralized energy grid. And so there's a lot of ways in which the model just doesn't work for climate change or for sustainability. And especially when you count in the waste as well, which is essentially putting thousands of generations at risk for our benefit. So I don't find it to be a functional way out. As much as, and what's more, here in Japan, for example, after the Fukushima disaster, all the nuclear plants were turned off. Everybody was afraid that there was going to be an electricity shortage. So everybody started using less electricity. Electricity use in Japan went down almost 30%. 6 months later, the government of Japan told everybody to go back to using energy the way that they did because the income and value of the electrical companies was plummeting, and it was seen that the economy would follow those down. So to keep the economy stable, we needed to help stabilize the revenue stream of those companies. So we all did the right thing. We stopped using electricity when we didn't need to use electricity. And rather than do that, we're called upon to support the system as it exists. One of the key steps, I mean, think about the way we use electricity just unbelievably. It's essentially, if they're here in Japan, there are convenience stores like 7-Eleven, and there's one on every street corner because it's possible to make money if you open one, but it's an incredible waste of energy. There could be one every 3 streets. We could really redesign our system so that our usage of electricity, wherever we get it from, because it has a serious cost to our environment, and because we want to produce, we don't want to overproduce it just in order to encourage usage. We need to focus on conservation, and we need to focus on renewable sources, not things that create waste that needs to be managed, and that puts people at risk. One final thing I would say about nuclear waste is that nuclear fuel rods that are used to make electricity, they're used at a nuclear power plant, and then they'll eventually be buried underground. They're still all full of plutonium. That's how you make plutonium. Anybody can come along in 10,000 years from now and dig up those spent fuel rods down in those underground storage sites and make nuclear weapons from them. So we're manufacturing the material to use in nuclear weapons, and they will remain useful in nuclear weapons for 30, 40, maybe even 70,000 years. So it's crazy to just produce tons and tons and tons of this material and then just bury it underground and tell ourselves that that's probably going to work out fine and nobody's going to get hurt. So it seems like an insane technology to me all around, and its promise as a savior technology to come to the rescue of our situation with global warming is far over promoted by industry advocates, I would say.
Yes, thank you for explaining these things so wonderfully. Professor Bhattacharya, we can now conclude, I think.
Yes.
There are no more questions. Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, on behalf of the Department of English, University of Gorbongo, I extend my thanks and regards to Professor Robert Jacobs for such a wonderful session, not only for delivering such a wonderful lecture, but also for patiently answering all the questions and giving his insights into a very, very fascinating field of study. I hope this will not be the end of the discussion, and would like to have you with us in future as well sharing your insights and enriching our store of knowledge with your expertise. Thank you, sir. And before we call it a day, again, I have to make certain announcements. We all know that this program was shelved for a particular reason for some time. Now, however, it is back, and we have many other lectures lined up. Professor Laura Doyle is going to talk about inter-imperiality, and Professor John Rakakis is going to talk about Shakespeare studies, especially source studies of Shakespeare. And the fascinating title of the lecture is going to be Elephant in a Graveyard, Source Studies of Shakespeare. We are actually in the final stages of fixing the logistical part of it and fixing the dates. So let's keep our fingers crossed and continue with this wonderful process. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jacobs.
Well, Professor Bhattacharya, I'm very, very grateful to you for inviting me, and I'm very, very grateful to everybody for joining. And I wish everybody safety and health in this strange time where we are all locked in where we are. It's really a pleasure that I'm able to join you virtually. And any student who is interested in any of these topics, I'm happy to be contacted by anybody.
Yeah,
I'd be happy to provide resources or links or anything, or answer.
Professor Jacobs,
I will circulate the contact details and the other information with the students later.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I was, if he could have shared his email. So Professor Bhattacharya will share it with us.
Okay.
Later.
Absolutely. And please contact me if you have any interest in these things.
Thank you. And bye for now.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
I will now request the audience to leave gradually, and I will request our host for the session, Mr. Vivek Odhikari, to end the meeting.